Okay. Well, thanks for making it back. And after our wonderful ceremony we had over at the Common Good, just by way of a bit of introduction, I see my job here today, and possibly in the 2015 conference as well, as providing the thread of what we've been talking about and what we will be talking about in the Indigenous track to Whitehead, to Whitehead's philosophy and way of understanding the world and ways of gaining knowledge. That, just to clarify Ignacio's introduction this morning, that was kind of the topic of my dissertation, was a comparison between Whitehead's ontology, Whitehead's worldview and perspective, with Indigenous ways of understanding the world and ways of gaining knowledge. Now, I didn't do it with any particular cultural group. It was more looking at Indigenous scholars and how they described their own worldview, the worldviews of their cultures, and especially those that felt that these were commonalities with Indigenous peoples. I'm not Indigenous myself. My Indigenous roots go back to Germanic and Celtic roots, so they were cut off many years ago. Just to give you my perspective on where I'm coming from, and so you know that. So I can't speak to these worldviews as if I was Indigenous at this point. So it is an interpretation from my part of what Indigenous people are saying about their own cultures, in particular Indigenous scholars, as well as some elders. So that's kind of my job. And just have to put a caveat in that when I say Western, I mean Western European, Euro-American. It's a good distinction to make. But in academia, Western, of course, has been co-opted to be used as that perspective. And in fact, in my thesis, I ended up using Euro-American because that was the most common terminology used by the Indigenous scholars that I studied. So I just made it clear from the beginning that that's what I was going to use. So anyway, when I was looking at this and trying to figure out how this was going to be presented in 2015 and how I was going to present it here, the big question came up is why? Why bother participating in a conference like this? And so that's kind of what I'm going to be addressing here. And in the past, John Cobb Jr. has argued for the importance of an aim towards mutual transformation. That's been one of his themes. When pursuing interreligious and intercultural dialogue and encounter. Rather than a religious pluralist, which he's often been labeled as, he's often called himself a transformationist. But as usual when doing so, and if you know John Cobb, this is what he does on a regular basis, he also turns around and points out the potential limitations of this approach. So a primary concern is that the other that you're encountering may not currently be open to such transformation for one reason or another. They may be satisfied with the tradition the way it is and really see no need for change. So it works just fine for our community, thank you very much. We don't really see any need for change. Or it may also be true that the tradition is necessarily focused on sheer survival and not be in a position to entertain more change than what's already been forced on it. What comes to mind, of course, is the oppression by dominant cultures that we've been talking about and hearing about today and yesterday, and how much it's left its mark all over the world, with many traditions continuing to struggle with its ongoing effects. It's also possible that one's own tradition, say one's own tradition, may have a long way to go in understanding and acceptance before it has anything substantial or beneficial to offer back that could potentially have positive transformational value. So what have I got to offer back to the person that I'm going into conversation with that could be a source of mutual transformation? When I consider the type of dialogue and encounters that are the hopes and goals of the Indigenous track in the 2015 Seizing an Alternative Conference, I kind of see the potential for all of these stumbling blocks. First of all, although many of the major traditional ways, what John has referred to as actual ways, can be traced back a few thousand years, traditional Indigenous traditions as a whole have lasted for tens of thousands of years and possibly more, and have shown to be far more successful at coexisting with the natural world than any of these later developments. Secondly, as we're all aware, and has been so strongly illustrated by the film last night, as well as the ceremonies today and the talks that we've been having so far, Indigenous traditions the world over are struggling to survive. The Indigenous scholars and leaders are immersed in trying to keep their culture, language, and ways of knowing intact and relevant. They're struggling to have their communities be treated with common human decency, to have some resemblance of control over what happens to them within society in the present and in the future, and to be given the same level of respect afforded any other community in today's multicultural societies. They have to fight to get a voice as equals on committees that have ultimate control over their own futures and how their ancestral lands will be used and developed. Aboriginal groups the world over are struggling to develop and implement educational systems that work for their children, while at the same time fighting to keep their languages alive. These are just a few of the ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous people, but enough to raise the third issue as a question, why? Why should Indigenous scholars and leaders take the time and make the effort to attend and contribute to conferences such as this one and the one in 2015? What on earth can we, as Western non-Indigenous people, offer them that could possibly make it worth their while when so many similar avenues have failed and our track record is so bad? What is special about process thinkers? What's different this time? The biggest problem we have faced with when considering that question is something that has been proven over and over for the last 500 years. We don't get it. We just don't get it. Western European culture in general, and Western academics in general, do not understand what Indigenous people have been trying to tell us for centuries. Not really. We look at their narratives and see myths, some beautiful narratives we heard this morning, and see myths and legends that often contradict how we understand the world to work, and therefore view them as fanciful, childish, and ultimately false and of no value. Childish stories that may have some simplistic moral message or relay some sort of ancestral ancient knowledge that may at some point have been useful, but of little value in today's world. Stories about connection to the natural world and its inhabitants that childishly attribute life and personhood to inanimate objects, elemental forces, plants, and dumb animals. The mountain beings, the thunder beings, the rooted ones, the four-legged beings, the winged ones, and Pachamama herself. How does any of that make any sense in the light of what Western science has told us about the world? I remember chatting with a fellow student as we were coming out of a grad course on religious diversity when I was doing my master's studies. Indigenous religions had been mentioned in the class, and as we walked out, the student stated, "Those people worship animals. That's just crazy. I don't get it." After my initial shock, I tried to explain how I didn't really think that was usually the case. Besides the point that worship was a Western concept that did not necessarily apply in this context, I believed Native people had reverence for the divine as it was expressed through the natural world, which included animals. It was not, I thought, that animals or other aspects of the natural world were worshipped per se, but that the divine was present in all creation, so a relationship was possible through the natural world. After another pause, the response was, "It still sounds like animal worship to me. That's still crazy, and I don't get it." What I learned from that exchange was just how far Westerners still needed to go in our understanding of the Indigenous perspective, and just how true George Steiner's observation on translation was when he said, "To the baffled ear, the incomprehensible parley of neighboring peoples is gibberish." Native scholars and educators are even telling us that an alternative system of education is necessary for Indigenous children because of their different ways of gaining knowledge. And the truth of that is borne out with the horrendous failure of residential boarding schools and the statistics that show the relative scarcity of Indigenous students in higher education. Yet we can't really grasp why that might be. Isn't learning learning? Aren't facts facts? Why should be any different for children in one culture than for children in another culture? But that goes hand in hand with the rising recognition of the importance of traditional ecological knowledge that coincides with a widening gulf between the Western scientists and the indigenous cultures as to what TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, actually entails and how it should be defined and used. To the Western scientist, TEK is the environmental knowledge that's been handed down through generations, coupled with the complex awareness of environmental cues that people native to the land seem to share. And I'm sure most Indigenous people would agree partially with that definition, but that is the only definition that Western scientists can come up with. And so it always gets interpreted through that. Like all other data, they think, it is information that can be codified, quantified, and inputted into databases to be universalized and used over time in a variety of situations and locations. Yet to Indigenous people, traditional knowledge is a lived experience of the relationship between the land and the people that cannot be separated from either and remain intact and relevant. It is the way one lives in relationship with each other, the land and the divine, not merely the data that comes from that lived experience. It is dynamic, respectful, reciprocal, and comes with responsibility to the community, both human and non-human. It's not a commodity that can be codified and universalized. It is refreshed and made new in each moment and in each new lived experience. The disparity between how Native cultures view traditional knowledge and how it's understood by Western Euro-American culture is made strikingly clear in Canada's northern regions. Corporations that are applying to exploit an area's resources, whether through mining, logging, or oil development, often have to conduct a study which involves the TEK of a local First Nations community. This information is inputted into databases with the assumption that it's universalizable, and therefore only has to be done once. In fact, the corporations are often never obligated to consult the local communities again, no matter how long in the past the interviews were conducted, or whether the new proposed project bears any relation to what was originally in question. Once the data is obtained, sorted, and codified, it is considered applicable at all times, in all places, and in all contexts. This, of course, not only directly contradicts how such knowledge is understood by the Indigenous people themselves, but also commits what Whitehead refers to as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness and simple location. It reifies knowledge, concretizes it, by assuming the concreteness of something that is actually conceptual, and also assumes that it endures unchanged in different spatial and temporal contexts. For hundreds of years, Indigenous people have been trying to contribute their wisdom on how to live in relationship with the natural world, and they continue to do so, as we saw today. And for hundreds of years, we generally haven't got it. Certainly some of us have tried. I would even suggest that there are those that have legitimate Indigenous experiences of their own with the natural world. But because their own ancestral Indigenous traditions, our ancestral Indigenous roots are too far in the past, have legitimately and understandably had to turn to current Indigenous traditions for the proper protocols on how to respectfully and reciprocally deal with such experiences. These are human experiences, after all. And they can't be defined by racial boundaries. Those are the few that might actually get it. Possibly, I think. I know of such, actually, and they do. There are some that do. But the rest of us don't get it in the same way. And it's often difficult to tell the difference between those that are honorably on that committed path and those that are doing it for exploitation, personal financial gain, or simply on a fragmented New Age style quest. Western academics and well-meaning laity have continually appropriated anything possible from Indigenous cultures that they think might help gain value from the natural world, hopefully without paying too high a price or having to actually give something back. Because we don't really understand it, we also do not understand the consequences of such a one-way appropriation. Historically, we have not been interested in the reciprocal responsibility inherent in such a committed relationship that is fundamental to Indigenous cultures. It's not that there's not been a call for better understanding. A few years ago, Willie Ehrman of the First Nations University of Canada and a team of Indigenous scholars compiled a report entitled The Ethics of Research Involving Indigenous Peoples, in which, among other things, they challenged scholars to find an ontological and epistemological paradigm. So a paradigm that is a worldview and a way of gaining knowledge that moves towards reconciling the disparity between an adequate Western scientific worldview and the relational experiential perspective of Indigenous people. Ehrman advocates the need for what he calls an ethical space, where people from different worldviews can meet without the presuppositional baggage that prohibits effective dialogue between equals. E. Richard Outlaw and Gregory Kahete have both written books dealing with what they call native or indigenous science, in which they want to give indigenous ways of understanding the nature of reality equal status in the scientific quest for knowledge about the world we live in. Celebrated quantum physicist F. David Peat has written a book called Blackfoot Physics, in which he illustrates the astonishing parallels between indigenous languages and the ways of understanding the world with a quantum model of reality, rather than the typical Western early modernist perspective. But that's where the problem lies. Western European society is stuck in a metaphysical worldview that can't allow such a shift. As process scholars, such as David Ray Griffin, have pointed out, it insists on interpreting and judging everything through an outdated, substantist, and mechanistic view of the world, even though its own physicists suggest that a dynamic relational model of reality may well be more appropriate. The experiential, relational perspective that Ehrman, Outlaw, Kahete, Deloria Jr., and most other Indigenous scholars describe as integral to the Indigenous worldview and the ways of gaining knowledge is not taken seriously by the dominant culture. And until it is, they continue to not get it. However, that also addresses the why question posed earlier. Why bother participating in this conference in 2015? What is the difference this time? Here's the answer. Because this time we might just get it. This time, the accepted underlying view of the world by the participants is also relational and experiential. Whiteheadian process thinkers reject the modernist view of the world that insists that reality is mechanistically composed of inert substances that endure through time and space. They embrace an event-based process view that understands reality as fundamentally derived through relationships. Reality is the relationships between events that dynamically form in creating each new moment of experience, of existence. Here are a few quotes that the Whiteheadian process thinkers may find interesting. The chief proposition of the universe is relationality. Quote, against materialistic framing of the environment as discrete things stands it relationally framing the environment as nested relatedness. Quote, quote, if each relationship, in each relationship, in each moment in time, in each thought, in each word, and in each action is a teaching, which contributes to an intricate balance of a cosmic universe. And quote, rather than viewing ourselves as being in relationship with other people or things, we are the relationships that we hold and are part of. Like the Whiteheadians watching and here may be thinking, these quotes are pretty familiar. I wonder where Whitehead said them. Can't really pin it down where he might have said that. But of course he didn't. The chief proposition of the universe is relationality, Lakota elder Black Elk. Against materialistic framing of the environment as discrete things stands relational framing an environment as nested relatedness. Anthropologist Nurtbird David. Her studies are in Eastern Asian indigenous cultures in India. But she was also talking about some Canadian First Nations. Quote, in each relationship, in each moment in time, in each thought, in each word, and in each action is a teaching, which contributes to an intricate balance of a cosmic universe. Blackfoot scholar Betty Bastian. And quote, rather than viewing ourselves as being in relationship with other people or things, we are the relationships that we hold and are part of. Cree scholar Sean Wilson. These quotes illustrate the parallels between indigenous worldviews and a Whiteheadian metaphysic. I might get a little thick on the Whitehead for just a few sentences, but I tried to stay away from it as much as possible, so bear with me. I think it's still understandable. Both worldviews are fundamentally relational in that there are no things which have relationships. Things are constituted by relationships. Such an understanding changes what can be considered possible and what's merely fanciful. Vine Deloria Jr. also stated that for the Native American, the substance of the world is relationships. He says a central tenet of Native worldviews is that, quote, everything in the natural world has relationships with every other thing, and the total set of relationships makes up the natural world as we experience it, unquote. Like many process philosophers, and Whitehead himself, Deloria argues that a relational metaphysic is better able to accommodate a postmodern scientific understanding, as well as a wider diversity of human experiences. He says that many of the out-of-the-ordinary events attributed to ancient medicine men are considered fantasy only because they are evaluated from the narrow, materialistic framework of the Euro-American culture. Deloria suggests that rather than this non-substantist relational mind-energy quantum view being the culmination of philosophical and scientific inquiry, as it is in Euro-American historical thought, it was the beginning from which the native daily life stemmed. He states, quote, we have already seen that tribal peoples observed the world around them and quickly concluded that it represented an energetic mind undergirding the physical world, its motions, and provided life and energy in everything that existed. This belief, as we have seen, is the starting point, not the conclusion. Indigenous ways of understanding the world and gaining knowledge, then, are through a lived, relational participation in the world. Learning about the world involves learning about and through the relationship one has with the world. Deloria describes a particular experience of black elks, in which he was caught out in a storm while hunting. During the night, he heard a coyote howl in the distance and understood the howl as communication informing him of an old man and a boy that were also caught in the storm, and the location of a bison that could serve as food while they were stranded. Once the storm abated, he was quickly able to find the man and boy, as well as the bison that was trapped in the snow and easy to kill for food. Although Blackout described it in a way that suggested he understood the coyote howl linguistically, Deloria says that the transmission of accurate information at that level of profound internal relatedness does, and for the Whiteheadians again, pick up on that, internal relatedness, does not depend on language, but simply heightened awareness or alertness. The information, therefore, might be perceived as visual images, language, or just an intuitive knowing. But it is the internal relationship one holds with the world that allows the transference. From an Indigenous perspective, this is a fairly typical way in which Indigenous people are able to gain knowledge about the world. We heard one description of that this morning on being able to navigate by the stars, by closing your eyes, and how that elder did it. So, able to gain knowledge about the world through relationships with the natural world that have been forged and maintained. For a typical Euro-American perspective, this is a fanciful story involving dreamt hallucinations and lucky coincidences. The only other explanation, as far as Western society is concerned, would be that somehow Black Elk must have unconsciously merged a complex set of environmental cues which allowed him to locate the people in the bison. Somehow he was able to do that. Yet from a Whiteheadian perspective, this could be an example of what David Ray Griffin refers to as retroprehensive inclusion. It's action at a distance. It's becoming cognitively aware of the prehensions, which are the primary mode of perception for all entities. If we are mostly, although not completely, constituted by the perception of the entirety of our past relevant world, then it is possible that under certain circumstances we could become aware of aspects of the world that are not available to the secondary mode of perception that involves our sense organs. Although such awareness may not happen often, a Whiteheadian process metaphysic allows for the possibility. This view has certainly not been accepted by all process scholars, one such as Donald Sherburne, for instance. If we were continuously cognitively aware of our own past entire world, says Sherburne, our experience of the world would be much different than it is. We would all be consciously aware of both what was happening in places other than when and where we were, and what would likely happen in the next moment. Vehicle accidents alone provide evidence to the contrary. But Griffin says that just because we're not continuously aware of such perceptions doesn't mean they do not happen. He admits that the overriding intensity of sense data that we are bombarded with would usually preclude such awareness. However, if one was able to focus attention away from sense data, perhaps by closing one's eyes in the middle of the ocean, such awareness would be far more probable. Cobb's response to Sherburne was that it seems that people often have these experiences, understanding them as intuition or divine guidance. I would suggest that the altered state of consciousness inherent in meditation, prayer, trance, ceremony, sacred dance, visions, and dreams, all of which are vital to indigenous traditional ways, is ideal for the focused awareness that may facilitate such uncommon ways of gaining knowledge. A story told by Elliot Cowan in his book, Plant Spirit Medicine, describes how indigenous specialists can become cognitively aware of the distant past, not only of themselves, but of others. Cowan describes an ethnographic account he studied as an anthropology student that is consistent with the indigenous understanding of the efficacy of knowledge gained from such internal reflection. In the story, an ethnographer had spent some time among the Aboriginal people of Australia and had heard about the skills of a particularly proficient tracker that were apparently so incredible they appeared fraudulent. Cowan relates, quote, "When he finally met the tracker, he challenged him to follow the trail of a long trek he, the anthropologist, had made with another Aborigine years before. He was certain this was impossible and that no trail could remain after such a long time." Remember, this is probably desert and impossible to find tracks after that point. The tracker was happy to take up the challenge, though, and the moment he was shown the starting point, he took off at a trot and ran the whole course of the journey without even pausing to examine the spoor. So he didn't even take a look down to see what the footprints were. The anthropologist was humbled and apologetic. He asked the Aborigine how he had accomplished this. "It was easy," the tracker replied. "I just went back to the time you made the journey and ran along beside you." To the indigenous specialist in this case, accessing knowledge from the past was no more difficult than remembering what had happened a few moments ago to himself. In fact, he did not track the anthropologist at all, but simply became cognitively aware of his objective past and followed alongside. In any case, what's important to note is that if reality is constituted by relationships, then epistemology, or how one gains knowledge, is inherently connected to actively establishing, maintaining, participating in, and gaining knowledge about and through these relationships. And as Betty Bastian, Gregory Cajete, and even David Griffin suggest, having a closer relationship directly relates to the possible success of transferring knowledge. Bastian calls such established relations alliances, Cajete compacts, Griffin sympathetic relationships. In a relational worldview, therefore, ontology and epistemology, how one views the world and how one gains knowledge about the world, merge. One cannot be understood in isolation, without reference to the other. If a relational metaphysic is presupposed, as it is in both indigenous and process understanding, it is through the relationships that one can come to know about the nature of reality. This relational way of understanding the world puts a whole new perspective on the wisdom that indigenous people have been relating to us for centuries. It helps us understand why indigenous education requires a completely different model of how to teach than is currently popular in the dominant society. Within such a model, education is far more contextual and experiential. It is a coming to know rather than a memorization of dead facts that cannot effectively be relevant in the constantly changing world of a process relational view of reality. Knowledge comes from experience, and one's experience of the world changes in each new situation. The world itself is ever-changing, requiring an educational system that prioritizes how to gain knowledge in each new moment as one's relationships change, and the reciprocal responsibility that goes with such knowing, rather than memorizing and universalizing inert data. This way of understanding allows for far more sensitivity toward the ancestral land claims and the importance of sacred sites that require ceremony and ritual to renew and strengthen the relationships Indigenous people have with the natural world. If indigeneity is about connecting to the divine and the wider universe through the land, as I would argue, then in a relational world, identity creation is bound up with when and where one lives. Severing ties to a particular land base severs the connection to one's own identity as an integral and interconnected part of the world and ultimately the divine. And although the whole world could be considered sacred, sacred sites, which for centuries have hosted ceremony and ritual to establish and renew the alliances, compacts, and sympathetic relations, can be better understood as unique places in which such relationships are what in process language would be considered more intensely relevant. Without renewal, such critical relationships may fade. The narrative, stories, and songs take on new meaning, as does the mythic imagery that represents the ways of knowing embodied in these narratives. Such symbolic reference incorporates knowledge gained through reflection on information gathered through the primary mode of perception, one's relationship with the world and the divine, rather than merely through the secondary mode of our sense perception. There is much more to gaining knowledge about oneself and the world than can be achieved through merely relying on the intense data we receive through our five senses. It also illustrates the importance of the contribution Indigenous wisdom can make toward the ecological civilization that is necessary for the survival of the planet. In fact, it puts into perspective Okanagan scholar Jeanette Armstrong's call for re-indigenization of the entire human race. We all have indigenous roots if we look back far enough. My own Germanic and Celtic connections were compromised a couple of thousand years ago, but existed nonetheless. To save the planet, we need to renew the relationship to the earth that we all once had, but is now only held in the hands of those who live in a traditional indigenous way. We need to widen the definition of what it means to be indigenous to include the potential all people have for re-indigenation. Cree elder fishwoman, or Pauline Johnson, tells a story from her lineage about how the sacred pipe came to the First Nations. At first, Creator offered it to all four of the human races: the white, the yellow, the brown, and the red. The pipe was a way for the people to unify the relationships of all seven directions and communicate more directly with the Great Mystery. However, this offering was only accepted by the red race. Fishwoman says that although the other three races rejected it at the time, the red race decided to honor Creator's gift by holding the pipe ready for the other races to take up when they were ready. She feels that because of the state of the world today, perhaps now is the time that the pipe and the ancient wisdom it represents is once again made available to all races of the earth. It is now critical for the survival of the planet that the indigenous wisdom and ways that have been held for so long by First Nations people throughout the world are passed on to all people. It is just as important that we are able to accept and understand such a gift and reciprocate in an appropriate way. Perhaps most applicable to the 2015 conference, acceptance of such a relational worldview allows for Indigenous people to participate in intercultural dialogue and encounter as equal partners. I'm suggesting that a Whiteheadian process metaphysic accepts and answers the challenge by Ehrman for a Western perspective that moves towards reconciling the disparity between an adequate Western scientific worldview and the relational and experiential perspective of Indigenous peoples. The obvious and significant parallels between process thought and the Indigenous worldview answers the question why. Because it's in a unique position to get it. To finally understand and help move forward the wisdom Indigenous peoples have been offering. In a very real way, seizing the alternative toward an ecological civilization is not merely accepting the Whiteheadian way of understanding reality. It is, to use Armstrong's terms, the re-indigenation of humanity, so that we can finally understand and implement the wisdom of our current Indigenous peoples and our past Indigenous ancestors. We all need to make decisions that keep in mind the 7 generations that have come before and the 7 generations that have come after. Finally, a quote that pretty much sums it up from traditional Cree elder Pauline Johnson, or Fishwoman. who was born and raised in a traditional way at Leicester in northern Alberta. Many elders will say that we are related to everything on earth. Some people think that when we ask them to pray to the grandmothers and the grandfathers, that is their biological ancestors we are talking about. We do acknowledge our grandmothers and our grandfathers in our lineage. We put them in a place of respect and love. But the grandmothers and grandfathers are also everything here on earth. As I was growing up, I was always told that all of these things that were here before me, that they were all grandmothers and grandfathers to me. Grandfather sun, grandfather moon, grandfather stars, the thunder beings, the rock beings, the mountains. They are the old ones, the old ones. They are in essence my elders, my teachers, and the creator above all, who created all of those things to give me the essence of my spiritual life. We recognize all things in life and that all things have life, and so that is why we call them beings. We are human beings, so they are plant beings, rooted beings, universe beings, sky beings, thunder beings. We are human beings on this planet, and we are the two-legged. But everything out there, we acknowledge that they are part of us, part of our life, part of who we are, and we are part of them. Thank you.
Here. Woo. Yes. Yeah, you're on the hot seat now. I think next to him, I think.
Unless there's any
expand,
questions
right?
or anything beforehand, before you respond, or maybe after the response.
How can we get a copy of what you said?
I can certainly make a copy available.
Please.
And the other thing, don't forget, this is being recorded, so you can access it.
Access it?
Huh?
Through Claremont University?
No,
Center for
Andrew, please
Process
don't. Maybe say it on. Well,
There'll be a link on our website.
Yeah.
So there will be a link on the Center for
On the
Process
Center for
Studies
Process Studies website. So
of the talk.
Yeah, and so before Dwight responds, and we should have a long introduction, but if I really were serious about introducing him, the introduction would be longer than what he's got to say. So,
I'll introduce myself.
Exactly, that's what I trust that. Second thing is, I just don't want you to be confused. There are two schools of Whiteheadian thinkers, Canadian school and American school. The American school is process thinkers, and the Canadian is process, okay? We discovered that in Krakow, so, all right. Please, I guess you can just widen, right? Yeah, there you go.
Tomato.
And if we ask questions, please speak loud because the microphone is here. I know for sure at least one person, Dr. Cobb, is online, and when I turned it on over there, it really couldn't hear very well. So that's why I moved it a little bit closer. I think Cobb can hear me even without the thing over here. But the rest of you just be aware of that and move closer also if you want to ask questions. There's plenty of expensive seats closer to the thing. And don't pan out too much so that people really think that this is a sold out event. So, all right.
Good. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be in conversation to John Cobb and Ignacio. Chris, my new brother from above the border, Nancy and Andrew, and others who have helped to make this possible. Anytime you want me to be here in Southern California, particularly between November 1st and March 31st, I'm willing to be here.
All right.
So if you need anybody to teach winter quarter, I'll be able to teach for. So I'll put that on the.
I'll second that.
I'll put that in the World Wide Web. So
Reduced rates, right?
Well, reduced rates indeed.
Tell us a little bit about your background in Chicago.
Right, I was gonna transition to that. Was just a little intro humor there. Okay.
Intro humor.
That was the joke.
Yeah, I actually was born in Richmond, Virginia, in 1953 in St. Philip's Colored Hospital. So I was born and raised in segregation, but as my brother number 4 used to say, we didn't have segregation in us. We had six, my father and mother had 6 sons and 2 daughters. I'm the number 8, and I'm the first one that was born in the hospital. During those days, the doctor came to the house to deliver. And we're a first urban generation, my parents from the rural area. Gushland County in Richmond, Virginia, Henrico County. and they grew up in the rural areas. My mother's father was a farmer, a business farmer. He owned commercial tobacco and then sustenance food for the family and extended family in a huge house in the rural area. And so he was a businessman. And my father's father was also a businessman. He lived in Henrico County, and he had 3 different businesses, which were very rare for colored men during those days of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. My father was born in 1907, and he died in 2002, so he lived to be 95 years old. And so he is very much part of the living ancestor as far as father-son. Father-mother is another relationship, but as far as the father-son. So when I talk about ancestors, it's very real. So he died, I was about 50 years old, and I think it's rare for any son to have lived with his father and learned from his father for 50 years. So they don't make them like that anymore. And he actually embodies, as my response to Chris and the conversation we had last night and today, my father embodies what I would call AfricanAmerican spirituality, which is a form of indigenous spirituality that is a mixture of various sources. But that's the larger topic or approach I want to take in a very outlined form, because Chris has laid out a very sophisticated but very accessible presentation of, at least for me, one of the clearest presentations and most important, decisive implications for Whiteheadian philosophy that, as you know, it's very difficult for the lay people, even those of us with PhDs. So I appreciate that, and also linking it very, deeply to Native American and indigenous spiritualities. But my father embodies African American spirituality. I asked when he turned 80, I interviewed him because he represents the folk. He represents the folk. Colored boys weren't able to go to high school in his day, so he has 8 children, and out of the 8 of us, we've got 4 PhDs, several masters, and several BAs, and several books that we've all published together. So they don't make them like that no more. No. So that's why I focus on him as a response of a type of African-American indigenous spirituality. When I talk about African-American spirituality, I think there's certain characteristics that resonate with indigenous peoples domestically here in the US and the North American continent and globally around the world. One is this emphasis on the communal. The idea of an individual in African-American spirituality doing something for himself or herself for the benefit of himself or herself is totally foreign to the reality of African-American spirituality. So the communality, I think we resonate together. 2 is relationality. If I grew up in a house of 10 people, so everything was relational. I mean, it was just, we drank relationally, we ate relationally, we went to the bathroom relationally, everything was relational. You would just, because how many people, you got to get in the bathroom, so you got to time that bathroom thing, you can't just, like my youngest daughter has her own bathroom, she can stay there all day, but as far as African-American spirituality, the importance of relationality is key. And the other piece, third piece would be an emphasis or lifting up the poor and the brokenhearted. This is very important for African-American spirituality. And we've touched on it to a degree, but I just wanted to put it front and center to appreciate African-American spirituality as it manifests obviously in the dominant example in the US, that is the Christianity, but also in terms of Islam, and even we have some Black Taoists emerging, but there are some core aspects or core values. And so, importance of the poor and the oppressed, the brokenhearted is part of that African spirituality. What I want to talk about is just one dimension of African-American spirituality, that is what it means to be human, and perhaps it may have some resonance with what you've talked about and with what others, indigenous folks have talked about today and last night with the return of the Navajo boy. Now, the African-American spirituality has these 3 primary dimensions or aspects: communality, relationality, lifting up the poor and the brokenhearted. But the spirituality is indigenous in this context, that is a North American space and time, because it's forged out of at least 3 major streams. The primary stream, of course, is the African stream. And I think Dr. Mwala Karinga this morning gave a brilliant exposition, and he embodies it. You know, I mean, the charisma, he embodies it. And see, I can't preach like that, but he embodies that, right? So you saw that. So he represents that. So the African-American spirituality, particularly what it means to be human, is funded or streamed by African traditional religions. It's also one of the second streams in creating African-American spirituality is reinterpretation of slave Christianity, reinterpretation of slave Christianity. And third is this common sense folk wisdom that the non-formally educated people developed just day to day. That is, if you put your hand on a stove and it burns your hand, that's common sense folk wisdom. I mean, it's like that. And of course, this happened a great deal in relationship to slavery, in relationship to segregation, and in relationship to nature, actually, which we'll come to. And what we mean by African traditional religion, again, I won't repeat what Dr. Mwala Karinga said, but it's the importance of the communality, definitely comes from Africa. This relationality we talked about, the sense of being compassion, deep compassion for the widow, the brokenhearted, the emotionally bruised, and the materially poor. And also, of course, is the emphasis, as he clearly delineated this morning, the sense of being in relationship with nature. As I mentioned, my father's background, his father's background, my mother's background, her mother's background, very much part of this African-American spirituality of being in contact with nature. So African traditional religion, we just talked about. The reinterpretation of Christianity, as many of you know, the primary missions to the slaves, the enslaved 1619 to 1865, and this were particularly in the East Coast and New England and the South. African-Americans was, Africans and African-Americans, was to preach a type of Christian missionary words or sermons that said, slaves obey your masters in shorthand. And various texts in the Christian Bible, Hebrew texts, Old Testament, New Testament, you can pick and choose what you want, but they were all used, these picking and choosing. Passages were used to enforce this proclamation or this vocation or this damnation, if you will, that enslaved Africans and African Americans should obey the slave master. So what these enslaved Africans and African Americans did was they heard this, and those who could pick and could read somewhat, they reinterpreted it to mean that the gospel of Jesus Christ, and particularly the Old Testament message, was one of liberation, So reinterpreted Christianity. And then the common sense folk wisdom would be, again, you know, we hear such things as lessons you hear. In fact, those who've gone to black churches swear that these common sense folk wisdoms are in the Bible. They're not. But you hear such things as God sits high and looks low. People say, oh no, that's in Joshua, whatever. No, that's the common sense folk. Over the years and decades and centuries, this served the purpose of the people and became another text, an indigenous folk wisdom, African American spirituality text. And so all this fusion is going on. Okay, all this fusion is going on. And we can go on. There are a couple of brethren and sisters in here who, if I said the beginning of a sentence, they could fill it in. Especially got some Trinitarians over there. And so again, we're just trying to lay the backdrop for perhaps some commonalities and expectations for the conference in 2015 between what I'm calling a form of indigenous African American spirituality, which is unique in the sense of this particular time and space experiment called the United States of North America. We can find all of this, examples of all of this, particularly in various texts, both oral and written. This being African American spirituality that's created by these three streams. We can find them in 41 volumes of interviews with formerly enslaved in this country. I mean, I had to do microfiche back in the day. That's when you had a Gazette and all of that. Now Wikipedia. Wow. But you can get them 41 volumes. That's one. We're talking, where does this information come from? Yeah. Where does this idea that there's African American spirituality? And where does this idea that African American spirituality is defined by these three things and has these characteristics of the communal, the relational, the poor, and the widow, and even nature? Well, 41 volumes of the folk, the formerly uneducated. Wow. and it's a rich source. Another source is there are 100+ autobiographies of formerly enslaved, both runaways, those who bought their own freedom, and those who were freed by their slave masters. There are over 100+ autobiographies. Those are the two major sources, but there are also records in various church archives, particularly in the southeastern part of the United States. United Methodist has some great archives. And then, interesting enough, a lot of the plantation mistresses used to sit around, I guess, drink julep, and they would take records of the black people, you know, which is actually because they would sometimes identify the nature of the worship, and not all that worship is what, you know, what they were told by the plantations, pastor or priest. So whether they thought they were doing good or whether they were not doing good, the fact is we do have some written records. So these are some sources, oral and written. And for many of us, there's the deep oral wisdom that has come down from parents, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. Again, for me, because education to me and knowledge is embodied in real people, we can go back to, let's see, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-grandparents. So my, both sides, my great-grandparents on both sides were enslaved in Virginia. And then we can go back to great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, which is very rare because unlike any of the other immigrants, again, African Americans are immigrants.
Yep.
Forced immigrants. The native indigenous people are the indigenous people. Just like every other immigrant population, we have to trace our history back to Africa, primarily West Africa, but we have a problem. Something called slavery. Okay. You know, people go back Celtic, German, and all this types of stuff, but there's a way to find it. That is because you have to, slavery supposedly ended in 1865 in the United States. But what you can do is go back, and again, we're on AfricanAmerican Spirituality and how to trace it through tradition. You can do this by looking at the records of the hogs and the pigs and the cattle, because taxes. And so if you look, and I've done this with microfiche back in the 70s, I don't know what it is now, it's probably much more ready. You could say, John Smith, plantation owner in Henrico County, Virginia. Right. And then his 1860 tax records. We do, taxes coming up for us, right? So if you look under his taxes for his plantation, he'll put, 2 mares, 2 horses, 2 mules, one negress. Then they'll describe, missing a left tooth. Then it's because their names changed every time they were, but you can actually do it. It's possible to do that. It's very hard work. We go back in terms of spirituality, primarily from the West Coast, Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana, our family. So we claim that. African spirituality, how it arises, what it suggests. But let me just give 4 concrete examples of what we mean by African spirituality, particularly when we're talking about what it means to be human. Because I think that really is one of the basic commonalities we have amongst people, the indigenous people, and perhaps those of us who were either brought here as immigrants or forced to come here. In African American spirituality, you find this example of the trickster, the trickster figure. And the trickster figure is usually related to reversal. And you can go from, I guess, Santa Monica to East Oakland to Southside Chicago, Roxbury, Boston, Harlem, Florida. You can, in black communities, and you'll hear these tales or know of these tales. And one example is this question of the trickster and reversal. And basically the trickster, particularly African-American religiosity, is someone who's able to use nature, use what's at hand to trick the powerful. Brer Rabbit. Yep. If you ever heard of Brer Rabbit, would be the classical example of the trickster figure. And he's teaching, and it's oftentimes she, but usually he, teaching us how to be human. To be human is to use whatever resources you have to stand in the gap for those who don't have and reverse the situation. Usually what happens is Brer Wolf or Brer Fox has monopolized the forest. And again, here's that nature piece, right? It reverberates in all 4, as you'll see. and the issue of communality and relationality and the poor and the brokenhearted and nature, all these things reverberate in these 4 examples of to be human. And so the trickster, the rabbit in this case, uses whatever power, whatever resources, whatever means he has, in this case he, to reverse the situation. And the end result is he opens up the resources and make them communal. So everybody can eat, not just Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. And so the trickster reverses in the context of nature and other resources. Another example would be the outlaw, would be a second example of being human in this form of African-American spirituality. And again, note that I'm saying all forms of African-American spirituality, Christian, but beyond that. The outlaw, the trickster relates to reversal. The outlaw relates to ambiguity, the ambiguous nature of being human, both our good side and an ambiguous side. A great example, the rabbit for trickster and reversal, outlaw would be Segalee. Segalee is a character that often, when I grew up, the men told the story when the women weren't around. So since we're in a Christian thing here, I won't go into all the details of Segalee. But Segalee is a very ambiguous character. His relationship to women, which can be somewhat misogynist. Sometimes his relationship to the stability of however we can define family, but the family and stability for the children. But at the same time, he's an outlaw. The community can also love him when all these stories are told. But when that story is told, people can identify how he's an outlaw to the police, which is usually white police, but now it's probably updated to any police. Yeah. He's an outlaw to the businesses who says you can't have this food, but Segalee will go in there and take it. So on the one hand, he's got this good but not so good relationship internal to the folk, black folk, but at the same time, the folks who are hearing the story can root him on when he goes out and he breaks all the laws. Where other people might take their hat and say, yes, yes, Segalee is not taking any hat off. He grabs what he wants. So the ambiguity is Segalee. A third example, so we're talking what does it mean to be human in African-American spirituality. A third example would be the Conjurer. And the Conjurer is specifically dealing with nature and says that he or she relates to nature. A good example there would be the root worker in African-American folktale. And believe it or not, there are some people I know with some PhDs today with a rabbit foot. I'm not gonna call their names. They got rabbit foots in their briefcases. Present company excluded, I'm sure. What you got in there? Come on, Chris. It's got a rabbit foot in there. I meant African-American scholars in particular. Or they have a comparable rabbit foot. Whatever that is. And that's a long tradition that comes out of a form of African-American spirituality that comes from the folk, if we will. But it's saying that human beings are by definition constituted by, defined by, can escape from and don't want to nature. And one has to work with nature to be, the Conjurer works with the laws of nature. That's why he and she, here we have a lot of she's here, so this is the story, are so successmountain. The Conjurer will work together with all types of roots or chicken or wind or water rolling off from the mountaintop to help you with the lover, to help you with rheumatism, to help you with anything. And there's a story in these 41 volumes where they talk about, when the interviewer from the North is interviewing all these formerly enslaved Africans, African Americans, they said, well, you all are Christian? Oh, yes, we're Christians. And she said, what about the root worker, Conjurers? Well, there's something the preacher can do, but there's some other thing the Conjurer got to do. So we got to use both. There's no dichotomy between the preacher and the Conjurer. Certain things Conjurer had to do that he didn't want the preacher to do. He didn't want the church to know about. So a Conjurer again, but the thing is to work with the nature, to respect the laws of nature, and to know that to be conscious that we are in relationship to nature. I could imagine people, they'd have to be insane to come to Claremont and not see the beauty of nature. And you all are probably all spoiled because you see it all the time. 3 weeks ago in Chicago, it was 41 degrees below zero, okay? It is now 79 degrees here in Claremont.
Nature's just asleep at that time.
So, yeah, well, maybe, but I see nature everywhere, so it's just so great to be here. And the final example, again, we're talking about to be human as as an example of this African-American spirituality. Trickster, outlaw, conjurer, is the Christian. And here, we don't necessarily mean, it could be, that those who are formally trained with PhDs or those who are in formal positions of priest, pastor, deacon, trustee, church, anybody. It could be the everyday folk people. They are involved in a form of Christianity, which we call from reading these sources, empowerment. Christianity is a form of empowerment. And a great example would be Harriet Tubman. Yep. Harriet Tubman had a Bible in one hand and a hunting rifle in the other. No contradiction. Not an aggressive figure, but a figure that was set on freedom. That is, she had gotten her own freedom, but she went back, I don't know, was it 39 or so many trips back into slavery to free people. She had a bounty on her head. And she didn't have a compass, but she was able to pray and to lead people through the night, bodies of water, fields, woods, from, primarily mid-Atlantic, but maybe down to Carolina, maybe Georgia, to Canada. And it reminded me of the story we heard about the navigator who could close his eyes. And, so she relied on the Bible. But, it's like the Conjurer in Christianity. The Bible has one work to do, shotgun has another work to do, right? I'm for nonviolence, just to let you try. But again, all we're saying is that the issues of learning from the indigenous people who are the people, the primary people, at least in this space where I do my work, and other spaces times around the world, have a lot to offer us, and hopefully we can be in conversation to share with them and learn from them as well. So those are just some reflections, and I'm looking forward to 2015. Thank you.
All right.
Just as a response to the response, just before questions, very quickly, I just like this morning, I listened to a talk like this and I go, man, I could spend all afternoon tying the Whiteheadian threads to that, because there is so much to converse about. There are so many parallels. And just even what it means to be human. In Whitehead, what it means to be conscious is is a reversal. It's being able to imagine what could be, not just what has been or is. It's the reversing what has come before, being able to imagine and put forward a proposition as to what could be. And that sense of consciousness is what creates consciousness, and the highest of which, in this scheme, would be human consciousness. And then also the relationality, of course. But you mentioned the responsibility to the poor and down, and to connect that to Native Indigenous peoples. I call it the 3 R's, but there's actually probably 4 R's. Or maybe even 5, because I think it's also radical in that it's pervasive to everything. It's primordial, but it's respectful responsibility, and reciprocal relationality. Respect, responsibility, reciprocal relationality. And so it's that responsibility in the relationship. You can't have the relationship without the responsibility to that relationship, to the community. And the respect that's involved, and that it's reciprocal, which is the big thing I want to stress from my talk, is that what have we got to give back? Why bother to go into that communication? And realizing that deep sense of responsibility and relationality that you're talking about needs to be reciprocal. And it needs to be, in some sense, mutual. So in that sense, although it's a little bit of a play on what Cobb talks about, in that sense, it's mutually transformative. So just thank you very much for that, and just amazing to me, the kinds of links to Whiteheadian thought, no matter, from the ground up. So I look forward to more conversations in that regard.
Yeah, you field everything, but you
I'm
can ask.
fielding? Oh, I
You're
can't
fielding
ask
also,
a
but
question.
you can ask the first question.
Oh, okay.
Aaron,
Oh, I have so many. I just, because I was laughing about Segalee, I gotta talk about the Outlaw for a minute. One of the things that I really appreciate you doing in contrast to the professor this morning is that you're talking about African-American spirituality, which I've never actually heard anyone speak on, so I really enjoyed learning something here. But this notion of the outlaw, it seems to me, is really, really critical in this resistance and refusal, which is the slight difference from going all the way back to a pure African indigenous spirituality. And I was wondering if you'd, ever thought about it that way or could comment on that.
Yeah. They're all four: Trickster, Conjurer, Christian empowerment, Outlaw. They're all forms of resistance and retrieval as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what happened was that there's a fusion.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got various sources going through. There's the African, no question. To me, that's the foundation.
Right.
But then we also have this imposition, invasion, or whatever you want to call it, introduction of Christianity. Black people in the United States, Africans, enslaved Africans, African Americans in the United States, or the colonies, were mission. It was called plantation missions, just like indigenous people and people in the developing world, third world. We're not an indigenous Baptist. People think Baptist is the indigenous religion of black people. Hallelujah. I'm ordained Baptist, so you can out me out of the closet here. With an Episcopalian sensibility, actually. So that's the largest thing, to the piece about why I'm talking about African-American spirituality, because that's what happened. But the foundation is definitely African. The outlaw, you mentioned outlaw, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the outlaw, it's a form of resistance. But what I'm trying to do is to say that survival, resistance, recuperation, and visioning operate on various levels.
Uh-huh.
There's the intentional, conscious part when we see in Christian empowerment, like the Harriet Tubmans and the Fannie Lou Hamers, and of course we know the usual male call, right? Martin Luther King and all of that, Malcolm X, which are still part of the pantheon, but there's some other folk too who are working. But Christian empowerment is much more the conscious, intentional liberation piece. But there are other forms of resistance, everyday resistance, of masses of people who don't get in the highlights of the Chicago Defender or the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, and the most authoritative medium in the world, Jet Magazine, okay? All right. They don't get those headlines, right? These are the mothers and fathers and the deacons and even the blues Saturday night party people who, wipe some snotty nose, or put a little $5 in somebody's pocket and say, boy, or stand up straight. So there's a form of survival and resistance and recuperation that takes place that complements the intentional, Tubman and
Right.
Fannie Lou Hamer and Malcolm and Martin. But probably the majority of people are operating these other three levels of everyday resistance, every day. And that's, that holds us up in between times. Some people would say that we're now in the United States sort of like in a lull period as far as conscious resistance. I don't think so. I think what Dr. Karinga taught us this morning is that there's always hope. I mean, that was one of the clearest things he talked about. When somebody said Africa's falling apart, he says, no, there's always hope. So I'm with him. I'm a perpetual optimist because I have a faith. Not just me, but there's an African-American faith that some of us are part of. I think Outlaw is an example of this resistance, rebellion, but they're all part of that, all examples.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins. And I have to say, I'm a student here at CST, an MA in Theology and Ethics student. And this is a real treat for us because we don't get this kind of intentional, conversation, discourse about indigenous spiritualities. And so, Dr. Hopkins, don't make, idle promises like, oh, I'll come here and teach, because I'm like, oh, could you please?
I'm just a squirrel in the world of God.
I'm just like, can we make that happen?
If there's a nut out there that needs cracking, just...
Well, I'm just saying, you say that here, and can we make that happen? So, at any rate, but thank you for your comments, because as I think about, and the influence of indigenous African spirituality on African-American Christianity. And so I'm always looking at and wondering why it is, sometimes you see in African-American Christianity that some folk try so hard to separate the influence of indigenous African spirituality on African-American spirituality. And so, like in my generation, we don't get a chance to see really that influence. And when you were talking about those common sense kind of, common sense wisdom, like in every class I have a purse chair because, you can't put your purse on the floor or else you won't have any money in it.
All right, they're coming out now.
Well, I'm not gonna say what I got in my pocket. But I'm just saying, why do you think that has happened like that over the years, that it seems like some folks have worked very hard to separate the influence of African indigenous spirituality on African-American Christianity?
Yeah, I think part of it is that those of us who are now elders, the gray hairs, but in each generation, in particular African-American context and African context, that we have to do a self-critique. We have to look at ourselves, and because I'm not, like Dr. Karinga said, I'm not one always blaming the younger generation. I'm with him on that. If the child acting a fool in school, go see the dad. Well, that's go see the parents. I mean, they didn't just learn this somewhere. So first of all, self. Those of us who have the information, those of us who experienced it, and those of us who are intentionally conscious about it, we need to teach. Each one, like the Black Women's Club, Negro Women's Club of the 1890s, which was the first civil rights movement before the NAACP, was the Black Women's Club.
Black Women's Club?
Yeah. They were the first
Yeah.
civil rights organization, and then of course national. But they had a model, each one teach one. And so I think that's very important. So that's one reason I think the importance of those who know, who are the elders. You saw a great example of today at lunch, the elders telling the story, the indigenous people, oral. Hopefully they write some books too, because we need that in the 21st century, but the oral piece is so beautiful. And a lot of us grew up that way. So I grew up the way, my father was the best. I wrote a PhD on all this stuff, right? But actually I grew up listening to him tell stories on all four of these. He was the best storyteller. He would make Brer Rabbit sounds like animals. He'd make things about the outlaw, all this stuff, Conjurer, Christian empire. So I had to get PhDs so people would listen to me, but my dad didn't talk. Is that amazing? Yeah. So one is that. Two is that I think there's a pressure, if we're in a culture and transplant to a culture forced or voluntarily, the larger story, the larger values that's the example of where, that's rewarded. People have power, money, privilege, their voice, if you can buy into that, And I think all of us are multicultural and multivocal. But the danger is that we just are awestruck, and maybe survival struck too, to buy into that which is dominant. And sometimes when we buy too much of that which is the dominant, and we lose a lot of the indigenous. And probably thirdly too, I think that those of us who come out of the slavery, post-slavery, segregation period, parents, grandparents fought so hard so children and grandchildren could be part of all these resources. Yeah. And provided private schools, provided maybe not just, but this is not just professionals, but also everyday working people. I work with Black men on the South Side of Chicago since 1998, and so people think that people are just gangbanging. These are working class people. They want the same thing everybody else has. They don't just wake up and start shooting people. They don't. It's just so crazy. They want the same thing. Everything that we have, they want for their kids as well. And so, they fight hard to get those resources, to get into the mainstream, and again, to that particular pull. So basically, looking at the elders, our responsibility to, seeing what is valued as normative and going after that. And three, just as parents, wishing the best for their children. Now that segregation is over. So at least those are three things I can think about. But I think when you hear people, a lot of people don't know who Dr. Karinga is.
Yeah, I know.
I can tell you all don't have any idea who he is. Just no idea.
No?
No, he is one of
Totally
the.
They know, but they know
Yeah, he is
Kwanzaa. They
one of
know
the
Kwanzaa, but they
luminaries.
don't know the-
And the thing is, you all got him right in Southern California. You know, people all over the other country and other parts, particularly African diaspora, are trying to pull him. And you really have a gift right here. And you think the guy's like 40 years old. You know, well, I used to listen to him when I was a little shorter. You know, and now I'm a little gray haired, so he doesn't age. Maybe a Taoist immortal or something, but.
Man, but,
Can we take
yes, oh, I'm sorry.
Can we take the next
Oh,
question?
I have a personal question since you weren't introduced. I have a family, my son lives in Chicago and his family, and when I tell him that I had the privilege of listening to you, he's going to want to know what your association is.
Oh, the professional ID. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
never heard.
Yes, I'm sorry. I teach at the University of Chicago Divinity School. I'm the director of MA Studies, and I'm a professor of theology in Hyde Park, as you know. That's
Yeah, because I've been associated with Neo Lombard.
Yes. You.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why you got that little glow around you. yes. Uh-huh. Yeah.
My son is he's the exhibitor at the Art Institute. He designs exhibits, so he's
Small
done a
world.
nice job.
Oh, no, very nice. Good. Sorry I was, yeah, that's what I do.
That's great.
Yeah, good, thank you.
I
And
loved walking
Ignacio
around the
has-
University of Chicago and going to lectures when I was minister in residence at Village Meadville.
Ah,
What a great time.
it is indeed.
Sorry I didn't run into you though.
No, maybe, yeah,
May have.
never know.
Yeah, and I want to make sure you know that there's one more person.
You're hiding. You're
I'm back in the
next.
corner.
So, did you need to leave again earlier? You could make your questions before mine, so.
Oh, well, I'm okay.
Okay, well then very quickly, because I don't want people to forget what the question earlier about the distinction between African religion and African-American spirituality. It's also a matter of age. He's a lot younger than Maulana. Maulana and I were born the same year. He's 3 months my senior. The experience was totally different. We were part of movements that wanted to go back to our roots. I actually was born in Mexico, which gave me a jump in a way over the Chicanos, who did not know anything about their history. But boy, Mexican Americans wanted to know about their history, and the Go Back to Aztlan movement was about the same time as the Go Back to Africa, not physically, but in the mindset and everything. So that African religion became very important at that point, rather than the African American spirituality, right? So that, I think, is the basic difference. The parallels are very interesting. You'll find them in all kinds of movements. You'll find it, for instance, in the Catholic Church, the difference between pre-Vatican II nuns and post-Vatican II nuns. And Vatican II actually coincided with that same period of time. Now, some of you may not know what Vatican II was either, because this is kind of like Maulana Karenga. Who's Maulana Karenga? Vatican II was the first major effort in hundreds of years for the church to become relevant to the realities that had been pushed by blacks, by Latinos, by the liberation movements in Africa and in Latin America and all of that. First of all, Pope John the 23rd opened the windows of the church first. He's the best pope, in my opinion, during my lifetime. I'm still holding judgment on Panchito, Papa Pancho, he looks good so far, but I think John the 23rd was the best. His successor was the one who, under instructions of John the 23rd, that was his dream, began then formalizing the changes that John the 23rd wanted in the Catholic Church. And so a Second Vatican Council, that means the First Vatican Council had been hundreds of years earlier, right? So in that Second Vatican Council, everything changed. Latin was no longer required. Many people didn't like that, And actually what happened is the Catholic Church began to, quote, segregate at that point in the United States. Because the people then just went to masses in Spanish or in English or in French or in Portuguese or whatever. Before that, it was all in Latin. You didn't care. You went to whichever church was closest to you. But something happened in Vatican II. The effect on the nuns was really radical. And Tim Robbins was the one who asked that question when he began thinking about doing the film Dead Man Walking, right? How many of you remember that movie? Okay. Sister Prejean, she had been liberated by Vatican II to take off her habits and everything else and get out into the community. And she decided, actually she was pushed by a brother, to enter into a relationship with a person in prison. But then he pushed her to actually enter into a relationship with a person in death row. And he said, and where are your habits? And she says, oh my God, I've been fighting all my life to get rid of these damn habits, and now I have to wear them, to go over to the prison. What happened when Robbins began thinking about making the movie, he began remembering the nuns that he knew that rapped his knuckles all the time in the Catholic school that he attended. And there was such a contrast between that and Prejean. Said, what the heck is the difference? And he asked Sister Maria Augusta Neal, who was also a little bit older than Prejean, why is it that these, this Hitler's sister, versus Sister Prejean, and she said age. And it's the same thing. The Maulana and you, or me and you, this 1941 to 1951.
Different generation.
12 years.
12 years, see? It doesn't sound like much, but that was a major change in those 12 years. So Maulana and I were back in those other movements, he in the African, I with the Chicanos. And so we really wanted to go back all the way. He doesn't, and I'm glad he doesn't. I mean, he appreciates that, and he travels there and all of that, but he's comfortable with the way things are here, and so am I, in a sense. And that's why I don't have to do what the brother, and although I respect what he's doing, turn into pagan, I can reformulate my Christianity in such a way that really enters to that. I'm sorry.
Great, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Hopkins, I was just
Yes.
interested in when you were talking about the characters, the archetypes, the trickster and conjurer. It was making me think back to, I did my master's at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago.
Wow, Hyde Park reunion.
Hyde Park reunion. And so I had done some research on the Genesis Garden of Eden story, because as a person interested in myth and story and Jungian psychology and transformation, I always thought that the serpent was unfairly maligned by Christianity. And so I did a lot of research on ancient Near Eastern serpent symbology and other things around that. And there are several scholars who really point to that story and the serpent as playing the role of the trickster. Now certainly the serpent understood the serpent in those times as multi, it wasn't just, it certainly was transformative and it certainly was chaotic and scary, but it was all about new life and all that. So I find it really interesting because knowing that that story was written by an author who was part of a land-based indigenous population, it makes more sense to me to think about that story as representing the opening of consciousness in humanity, not of sin. And so I see that as the trickster making resources available to everyone as a possible archetype for that story as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just to make yet one more connection, of course, in Native North American traditions, there's all of these figures are also represented.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Coyote is a
Coyote.
trickster, and the different cultures have different words for it, but the reversal, the one that walks backwards, does everything backwards, to do that flip. And these are figures that are not considered, they're necessary figures. They're not considered bad.
Right.
They're not considered evil or sinful or anything like that. These are necessary for the teaching and for the production of normal society. Those that have two natures.
There's another commonality that came to mind. Of course, we didn't know how much time we had, but
We're still keep going.
Lots of them. There's lots of them.
another part of it.
I want to squeeze it.
Right, take the power system. In particular, we also can debate what is African-American spirituality, we can debate what is indigenous.
Oh, sure.
But the tradition which I come in terms of African-American spirituality the importance of ancestors is very, very present. Very, I mean, heavily present. For example, we have a system in our family of recycling names when new children. So there are 3 Dwights. You know, there's so many Roberts and Williams and James and Charles and Richards. I mean, 3, 4 generations. And, you know, interesting enough, the Dora, but it sounds like, and some, that's right, sisters too, they have the middle names maybe. Yeah, but still, that's part of the traditions. Just that's a good point, though. But the main thing is that this is, and even so, people wouldn't know that this is an African tradition of ancestor veneration, not worship, that Dr. McCringa talked about. But this is a ritual. Now, there's another thing too. That ritual has morphed in the '80s when Chiniquas were introduced. But again, they thought they were doing African names. So still, I don't know if you probably don't get this, but you can sort of tell when children, like I teach, right? You can tell who their parents are, what ages are by the names, like that.
Yeah. The girls especially.
Yeah, especially the girls. But
Unspellable.
And same
Yeah.
with the Latino.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
But still, it's a reaching back,
Yeah.
cultural retrieval into the present, although it may not be word for word. So still, it too is an example of this ancestor recognition or veneration. So the naming piece continues even now. You know, my oldest daughter's named after my older sister, and my youngest daughter is named after my mother. And then my older sister named her son Dwight, and he named his son Dwight. So, and I can go on. We have Robert. I mean, if we were to do my family tree, and others in the neighborhood when we grew up, and now too the Chiniquas and forms of African. So the ancestors piece, but also the extended family part, which is the visible embodiment of the ancestors. The naming is the naming, but there's still a concept even in certain parts of the South Side and so-called ghettos, which is still, there's gangbanging, there's fracturing.
Yeah.
But I really like what Dr. Kring said, that hope resides wherever.
Yeah.
And that's what we got to emphasize. So even as I've been working with African American men, old and young, on the South Side of Chicago, the issue of the extended family is still there as well. So we could go on, but at least those 2 examples, the importance of the ancestors, I think is part of this question of African American spirituality.
I was just wondering about the time check. I was wondering about a time check in terms of what she was asking earlier
Yeah, I
about that.
think I'd like to at least go for 10 more minutes, huh?
Well, at least, I mean, we could stay even longer. I don't know how many, what is the schedule for everybody else here? This is what, in terms of what we still need to accomplish, is we have to have a meeting to work on the 2015, and that would be Chris's, and it doesn't have to be here. We can go to John Cobb's.
Right.
We don't need to have that on, and then Andrew can also have take Oliver for another party or something, a K9.
Before we
15,
do
20 minutes, I
Yeah,
think.
before we do that, I'd like to get our conversation, as fascinating as this is, I would like to turn back a little bit to the presentation that Chris gave.
Yeah.
You talked about this notion, and it kind of sounded as if you were making the argument that particularly in process thought or indigenous worldviews, that ontology and epistemology are joined or integrally linked in some way. And I actually make the argument that that's always the case. So I'm curious why you see that as particular to these systems of thought. Because the way I look at it is, you could say the same thing about, Western Euro-American, we have a substantive atomistic ontology, which leads us directly into an objectivist sort of empirical epistemology.
Okay.
So tell me more about why you're seeing it particular to these perspectives.
Well, the way you just phrased how they're linked in a substantivist mechanistic model is one leads to the other.
Right.
Or one, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying one is the other.
Okay.
That in a relational ontology, knowing, in a relational ontology that's based on a process of knowledge, okay? It's very difficult to understand knowledge as a noun in the type of relational indigenous perspectives that I'm talking about. It's coming to know, because if you're in a sense in process, becoming in each moment, every moment is coming to know.
So
It's
by
becoming.
that, are you
So-
saying knowing is equivalent to experience? Because knowing suggests a certain type of consciousness and awareness that Whitehead maybe argues a rock doesn't have, for example. So can you talk more about how knowing is experiencing then?
Well, because it is the experience of the relationships. You come to know the relationships in both, as the quotes I mentioned, as well as in Whiteheadian thought, you aren't something that is in relationship. You are the relationships that you have. And if that's the case, then coming to know about something is coming to know about that relationship. So all knowing is the experience of relationships. And in Whitehead, knowledge is reflecting on the relationships that one gets in the primary mode of perception, that prehension of the world. Gaining knowledge from that is the primary mode of gaining knowledge, and that's reflection on that experiential. Everything is experience. It's a moment of experience, right? It's an occasion of experience. So if each moment for each entity is an occasion of experiencing, and it's constituted by the relationships between things, the relationships you have, then knowing in each moment comes through knowing about those relationships. And so for instance, Betty Bastian, really, that's what the focus of her book is explaining how in Blackfoot ways of knowing, and they completely go away from the term knowledge, it's ways of knowing. It's about creating these compacts, these alliances, and that's what the rituals are for, that's what the ceremonies are for, and it's to renew those, create you've always got them. By creating, I mean reestablishing. Right, because you've always, if you're in a relational ontology, you have those relationships. You're not creating the relationships. What you're creating is that compact, that alliance with those relationships. You're becoming aware of those relationships and renewing that relationships. And that's what the ceremonies and the sacred sites and all of that do. And if you want to come to know about the world that you live in, you have to come to know about those relationships. So it isn't a matter of, and knowing that, and even it comes down to language, learning the language, and this is one of the, in my mind, horrible things about the loss of languages in indigenous cultures. It's because so many of the languages are ways of knowing about the world.
Right.
And by losing the language, you're losing those connections. And in my thesis, I talk about a pre-way of understanding and talking about things. For instance, a chair is something, rather than a chair, the term is something that you sit on.
Yeah.
So anything that you sit on is a chair.
Yeah, exactly.
And while you're sitting on it, it is a chair.
Yes.
So in that case, if you're sitting on a log by the fire,
It's a chair.
you're sitting on a chair.
Exactly.
Where we would say that you're using the log as a chair, that's a chair. Until somebody was going to pick it up and throw it in the fire. Now it's a log for the fire. It's no longer a chair. So, in Whiteheadian terms, that's a complete understanding of the fallacy of
Misplaced concreteness.
completeness,
Yeah.
as well as simple location. That
Exactly.
It's constituted by its relationships at that time.
Yeah.
So you want to learn about that, you go into relationship, you experience the relationship between things in order to know about the world. So knowledge is experiential and coming to know in each moment, and that's no different than your ontology. Your worldview is constituted by that.
Great, thank you.
sorry.
Were there any?
Well, before Rebecca leaves, I think, or before anybody else leaves, I want to make sure that we have a real-time check in the sense of, it is now 3 o'clock, and I wanted to know when, I know you need to leave, but what, 3:30 or 3:20? What's your schedule like?
Well, assuming there's any more questions.
Yeah, let's find out if there's more questions.
No, I think
That
that
may
if
be
we
it.
have the time, we will get the questions. I really believe that. So that's why, let's ask, can everybody stay around until 3:30? Andrew, how are you doing? You're okay?
until we're done.
So 3:30, can we say, okay? All right, so, okay, shoot.
Assuming that there's.
I was just going to make an aside about language. I remember Alfonso Martinez, the rapporteur for the Working Group for Indigenous Populations in Geneva, made a remark about language that just is carried me, you know, and it just spoke to what you were saying, that every time a language is lost, a door to the universe closes.
Mm-hmm.
Because that, you know, that sacred resonance that comes through language, through the understanding that language provides, is forever gone once the language is lost.
One of my favorite stories is I heard Jeanette Armstrong, Okanagan scholar that I mentioned, speak in Calgary last year. Of course, it was the week after I handed in my thesis. And then I heard her talk and was going, no, if only I would have done it 2 weeks later, I could have incorporated some of this.
You can in your next book.
Or the revised edition.
Or the revised edition.
But one of the greatest stories that I came out of that with is she talks about how the Okanagan word for water is. And it's 2 syllables. I can't remember exactly what it was. I don't speak Okanagan, but it's 2 syllables. And the first syllable is this action. So it's a reminder that, you know, this is humans drinking water.
Mm.
This is the life, this is sustenance for humans. And the second syllable of the word is
lapping like a dog.
that action. So it's every time they say the word water, they're reminded about the connection between water and not only humans, but the whole world and the connections between.
Yeah.
So, if, you know, and that's just one word.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a whole language like that? And, you know, the highly contextual language that have been lost, that where if you're not talking that way, you lose that connection. You're no longer being reminded every time you drink water, every time you say the word, you're no longer being reminded of that connection.
Right.
Which is why she's calling for her word is the re-indigenization of humanity.
Yeah.
Well,
part of the reason also I was asking about 3:30 is I made a whole bunch of notes as you were talking. But since you started talking about water, I'm going to go there first, and languages. And you were also making that point about languages. The Roman Catholic Church I mentioned in the 1960s did away with Latin as the official language of the Mass. You can still go to masses in Latin, but they are rare now. And there was a loss of Catholicity in a sense, in the sense of the universality claims of the Roman Catholic Church when they, using a language that was, quote, universal. So that was lost in a sense, when they gave up on Latin. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, and kind of funny, but also illustrating another reality about the language. Episcopalians are referred to by Roman Catholics and others, or were referred to. This joke will not make any sense anymore, as Catholics who are too lazy, meaning they did not want to learn Latin for the Mass, So that just doesn't make any sense now, because from 1965, 66 to now, it's a long time. People don't even remember about that change. Islam, on the other side, has not given up on the use of Arabic as the language of the Quran. And that kind of cohesion that Islam has today, I think, remains there because of the use of Arabic in at least in reading the sacred text. You can have the translation, you can read the translation, but when you use it ritualistically, and when you use it in your prayers, you have to use it in Arabic, And so I think that that's a very important issue that we need to explore. I don't know whether that will be part of the track necessarily, but that's an issue that needs to be explored in 2015. So I really liked all your references to the science, the indigenous science issues. And I can't remember now, but I think I read it in a book. But the quotation, this guy was quoting somebody else that said, "Isn't it uncanny how ancient sages plagiarized us modern scientists?"
Yeah.
So the Africans, the Aztecs, all of these ancient sages had intuitions that now the moderns had, so that the quantum physics and all of that people that. I have a concern about Vine Deloria in terms of its creation stories, only because he has been co-opted by the religious right to support their creationist claims against theory of evolution, and using that also to try to teach evolution and require the teaching of that in schools. They said, this is science and it has to be taught, and as superior also,
Co-opted
in the United
Vine
States, of course.
Deloria Jr.?
In the United States, I mean,
Really?
Yeah, that has been a problem. But the positive side about Deloria, which I mentioned earlier, is his call for forgiveness and reconciliation. That is an incredible. In that sense, I'm willing to say, and in general, in larger groups, I will not even say anything about that, about his blind spot vis-a-vis creationism, or at least maybe it wasn't his, but somebody else is instrumentalizing that. But because I think that the statements about forgiveness are so strong and superior that I don't want to undermine him at all. So maybe make a note, because I want to just list them all and then you can respond to that. And then the internal relatedness presupposes immense respect for all of nature. Then just two more things. One for you and then one for you. One that is that animals, this internal relatedness with our animals or with rocks or with trees and all of that. Animals who have been with us for a long time, namely horses and dogs, I guess cats also have been around us quite a bit, get it, in terms of the power of relatedness. And I was telling Andrew to bring Oliver, because I think Oliver is going to be a processed dog. But I have had experiences, and I've been more mindful of this. I've been watching the behavior of dogs around circles, and it's very different, And it came to me when I did a funeral for a dog. These two kids who were members of my church in Hollywood asked me to do a funeral, and the interment of the ashes, these kids got a tree and all that. There was a puppy, and died on them. And they did not know why he died, and the parents didn't want to spend the money on finding out how he died or anything like that. But they said, we're going to bury the ashes and plant a tree on top of the ashes, and we're going to do that on the side hill of the house where the mama of this puppy lives. So I went and scouted the place ahead of. Some people have heard me say that. I guess some of the ones who have heard me say this story, maybe Andrew remembers the story. Anyway, the mother met me. I went ahead of time because I wanted to see the layout of the place, and she started barking at me. Barking violently. And the owner of the dog said, "Don't worry, she'll calm in a minute. She's a good guard dog in that sense, but she'll calm in a minute. And by the way, welcome. I'm Jewish," she said, "and I'm atheist. But you can do whatever you want to do." So really condescending in a way. And actually, that bark wasn't as bad as the bark of the little dog. She kept on going on. How am I going to do it? Finally, the family got there with friends and the ashes and all of that. And the dog constantly barking. But as you can tell, I can speak loudly. And I said, well, I'll have to speak over the bark of the dog, So I said to everybody, let's get in a circle. And so we got in a circle on the outer deck. The moment the circle closed, the mouth of the dog also closed and didn't bark again. And the moment that dog went, "No, Mom," the owner of the dog said, "Oh my God." Yes, the atheist Jewish woman said, "Oh my God." So I told that story one time when a man had just come back from burying his father, who loved horses. He wanted to be buried by where the horses were, so they did it right by the corral. The horses were prancing around, so they all got off and all that. And then he asked people to form a semicircle. And he did not notice that the horses, little by little, form another semicircle behind him. So then there was a full circle, half of it with humans, half of it with horses. It's a very powerful symbol, and the animals around us get it. So that has also to do with the fact that we're going to work on a fire circle for the indigenous peoples over here. But it also has to do with the internal relatedness between humans and dogs. And Rupert Sheldrake, that's a name that if you're not familiar with that name, put it in your data, because Rupert is a British biologist who wrote a book called Dogs Who Know When Their Masters Are Coming Home. And he was highly respected until he wrote that book. The other biologists do not want to know anything about internal relatedness. And he's now just, but we in Claremont take him very seriously because it explains a lot of things also, and so last thing, because has to do with Africa and Latin America, and I mentioned this to Dwight last night. There's a wonderful PBS program. It is archived, and you can access it immediately. It's part of a series called Africans in Latin America, and the particular one that I love is called The Grandma in the Closet. The Black Grandma in the Closet. Mm-hmm. And it's Louis Gates Jr., who's the guy who is in charge of that thing. And the thing that's fascinating is that twice as many blacks went to the rest of the Americas than to the United States. And they were not, quote, enslaved. They were part of the Spanish encomiendas that I was talking about. The Amistad incident, helps, that and a movie called The Mission helps to illustrate the way in which the Spaniards sort of got around the issue of slavery and slave trade. They lied, essentially. They were deeply involved in the slave trade, but they entered wrong, data of what they were transporting and all of that, and they got caught every now and then. And in the Amistad situation, very clearly they got caught trafficking with humans. But they were deep into that. And so the consequence of that is that particularly, well, of course, the biggest country is Brazil, right? The Afro-Brazilian presence is dominant over there in the northeast part of Brazil. But there's an incredible, beautiful presence of blacks, but it is not as acknowledged in Mexico and in Peru. And this program with Gates, the Black Grandma in the Closet, is about the black presence in Mexico and in Peru, and it's really worth watching, So, and we have a lot more in common than we might suspect. All right, now you two can respond or.
Well, that was quite a bit.
Do they need to respond, or can we get a question?
If there's time, I'll respond to one little thing.
Rebecca?
I was just thinking about the syncretism of Afro-Cuban religion, of the Santeria religion.
Yeah.
You made me think about that.
Exactly.
And that, there's a whole area.
And the voodoo too, in Haiti.
In Haiti, but also that Afro-Cuban syncretism of having the African gods that are prayed to, and when really having this kind of it's an incredible history.
Yes.
And the Conjurer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they found there in Trickster as well.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But that's not, you find some communities, even here in the U.S., who, are practicing Ifa, which is another form of Indigenous African spirituality.
My family is Cuban, and they practice Santeria.
Oh.
They actually, part of my family practices Santeria, and they live here in West Covina. And no, it's just a reality. One part of my family is Jewish, and the other part of my family they're Catholic. Some of them are Catholic, and some of them practice Santeria.
Wow.
And you grew up under those influences, and it's a lot of richness of those heritages that blended together.
Yeah.
So the slave trade it just created a lot of different conditions for those sorts of things.
Well, and then Judaism also developed very interesting.
Converso and Marrano practices.
Exactly. But also I'm thinking about in Russia, the Georgian Jews are really superstitious, quote unquote, that there are, quote, teachings that have nothing to do with Judaism that are a lot closer to what we would be doing in Voodoo, Santeria, or these other practices. So Judaism itself found its way of saying, okay, we'll go with the Ave over here, but whatever, we'll go the other way as well. So,
and back in Mexico, where Jews could not practice openly in Spanish countries,
correct.
But when
Correct.
they had fled from Isabella and King Ferdinand. Came, and they would pray to, on Sunday, and then on Friday night, they would turn the crucifixes, and cover the crucifixes and make the Shabbat practices.
Yeah, and in New Mexico too, by the way, there's a priest who's a descendant of Marranos, a Roman Catholic priest who through DNA has actually discovered this. And now, he says, now it makes sense why grandma would cover or great-grandma, grandma, it was what she would cover the crucifix on Friday nights.
So grandma in the closet, and then there's the mezuzah in the Madonna's foot.
I love that.
It's a lovely story, and it
Yeah.
in Mexico, exactly that. And
So it's called the mezuzah in the Madonna's foot.
So then instead of when they were kissing the Madonna, they had put the prayer of the Shema in there, so they were able to practice their religion. So this kind of syncretism really speaks to going back to the indigeneity of peoplehood. And once you resonate with that, once you find that narrative, then you find yourself in the right relationship to each other and to the earth. And it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. Yeah.
The only thing, did you want to respond to that?
There's a new book out. It's the author's Noel Erskine, He's professor of theology at Emory University, Candler, and just came out. I think it's Oxford University Press. The title slips me, but he shows how black religions began in the Caribbean, not in North America. It's amazing. He talked about the blending and the maroon communities in Jamaica and the syncretism that we talked about, but it has implications for those who study the black church, the history of religiosity and American religiosity. So it's a major piece, and he wrote it more in a storytelling. It's very accessible.
Erskine, E-R-S-K.
E-R-S-K-I-N-E.
From Emory University.
Yeah, professor of theology. He got his PhD at Union Seminary in New York with James Coe, 1978. He's older.
He says gently.
Yeah, it is a fascinating history, those relationships between the Afro-Black community and the Arawak Indians and the Carib Indians, and how those religions that were strengthened. Because when you're honing your identity, because if you can live in two worlds, right, then you have to define those two worlds specifically, and to define what role am I playing now, which role am I subverting, which role am I amplifying. Right? And so it really gives you the opportunity to kind of really focus on, what's important now, what has to be important here and now, because it's socially acceptable. It's I had no idea that really. Thank you, Doctor.
Chris, did you have something?
Well, I was just going to do a very quick response to one thing that the Vine Deloria Jr. thing brought. I wasn't aware that his work was being co-opted for creationist stories. I know he's one of those guys that the more I read him, although I don't think I've read everything by any means that he's written, he's very prolific, but he's one of those writers that the more you read him, the more you go, oh, this would have been a great guy to know or get to meet, because as much as he wrote books and railed against the injustices to Native Americans, he wouldn't put up with any crap from anybody. He also didn't put up with crap from Native Americans, and was just as critical when they went off the rails as far as their thinking and how they did things. But I did read where he basically criticized or was against the land bridge idea of that's how Native Americans came here, that there wasn't a land bridge, or they didn't come down the land bridge. And it's similar to what was mentioned this morning, where they say, the establishment thinks we're only been here for 20,000 years or 30,000. We think we've been here forever. We believe we've been here. That sort of talk and conversation. And what he mentioned was that there's a problem here in the United States in that by calling Native Americans Native Americans, and by calling them Native, you're establishing the concept that they are native to the land. In other words, that they are native. And so land claims become a real issue legally, because if they can't prove that they're native, they don't have claim to the land, because they're just immigrants like everybody else. So in a way, to me, Vine Deloria Jr.'s response that the rejection of the land bridge idea was political just as much as anything else. Because if you didn't reject the land bridge idea, you put yourself in the courts, and it's in the courts this way, having problems with any kind of land claims that use the term native, if you can't prove that you're native and have always been here. The funny thing is that hadn't occurred to me before, because in Canada, we don't call them Native Canadians. We call them First Nations. So the conversation never comes up. The conversation isn't whether they were native here. We don't care.
They were the first people.
They were the first people. They were the first, so their claims are as the first people, not as native. And so the conversation is different. And so I don't know how much of it, I wouldn't want to conjecture how much of what you're saying, but I know one of the books he wrote that I draw on was, and where I mentioned that he said that a lot of the reasons why these images and these stories are rejected and some of the fanciful things that were attributed to ancient medicine men are considered fantasy was because of the mechanistic model. He has a book called The World That We Lived In.
He's far more on our side. You're right.
And he was saying, why are we discounting these as just imaginative stories? Maybe they did do some of these things. Maybe this is part of the natural world on how these things are done. And you read those stories and you can take a process perspective on every one of them.
Absolutely.
As it's, maybe that's possible. And that's sort of where I learned about this aspect is, I don't know. I wouldn't want to say that that's where his creationist stories, because he takes those creationist stories seriously.
I think it's using as support some of the people that are creationists on the other side. Let me. Are we about ready to finish?
I was just going to ask if we're.
Because I have.
Are we fulfilled for the moment?
I'm so grateful. This has been a wonderful day.
I have a Deloria quotation to finish, if it's okay. So are we ready to finish? Let this be the benediction. It's actually 3 quotations, all from the Wikipedia article on Deloria. The first one is, when asked by an anthropologist what the Indians called America before the white man came, and India simply said, ours. Second, who will find peace with the lands? The future of humankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibility to all living things. Who will listen to the trees, the animals, the birds, the voices of the places of the land? As long as the long-forgotten peoples of the respective continents rise and begin to reclaim their ancient heritage, they will discover the meaning of the lands of their ancestors. That is, when the invaders of the North American continent will finally discover that for this land, God is red. And the final one, which is my favorite, before any final solution to American history can occur, a reconciliation must be effected between the spiritual owner of the land, the American Indians, and the political owners of the land, the American whites. Guilt and accusations cannot continue to revolve in a vacuum without some effort at reaching a solution. So, how is that for a benediction? Thank you all very much.